Hey everyone, I hope that you're doing well. I hope you had a nice weekend. I was just able to complete reading through your tweets about the contextual nature of sources, as well as your Medium posts about how reading primary sources is different than secondary sources, as well as your comments about Michel Trouillot's ideas regarding the two kind of types of history or two ways of looking at history as what happened versus history as what was said to have happened. And so I'll make some comments about all of that here in a minute, but I wanted to talk about where we're headed this week. So we're right in the middle of Unit 5. Remember, Unit 5 goes for 3 weeks, so we've finished the first week. During this second week, this is probably where the most intensive work for Unit 5 will come into play. You'll be reading a set of sources that come from my dissertation research when I was up at the State Archives in Santa Fe. So everything that we've done in the first week, as well as Dr. Massoth's talk last week, for those of you who were able to make it or those of you who watched the video thereafter, all of those things will be helpful for thinking about actually doing this work of reading primary sources critically. So I have given you a little bit of context in the unit narrative in terms of the history of Columbus, New Mexico. There's also a bit of context in the Nash article that some of you read during Unit 3 for that first run through using hypothesis. If you didn't read that one, you can get it in the Unit 3 narrative, unit narrative, or you can also get some more context from my article that some of you read on the history of the Playsmith in Columbus, New Mexico. So they give different views of what was going on in the area where the 24th Black Infantry was stationed in the 19 teens and early 1920s. The documents then that you'll be reading come from Governor Meacham's files. He was governor of New Mexico in 1919, 1920, 1921. And he's the one who was kind of at the center of the conversations about whether or not the 24th Infantry should stay in New Mexico. So again, that's what you're reading this week. To that end, I'm offering a couple of optional Zoom meetups. If you would like to talk through the documents, just ask questions, talk about what obstacles you're facing as you're trying to understand the information provided in the documents, how to approach the assignment, all of those kinds of things. You'll be reading the documents and then answering a set of questions in a Medium post. You can read all about that in the Unit 5 narrative. So the optional Zoom meetings then, as far as these are times when I had some time. If they don't work for you and you would still like to meet and talk about the documents, let me know and we can try to set up an alternate appointment. But the first one will be Wednesday, March 3rd, so that's just a couple of days from now at 1:30 p.m. So 1:30 p.m. via Zoom. I'll put the links here. It's the same link that I use for office hours, so you'll also be able to find that other places here in Medium and in the syllabus and so on. So again, the first meeting is Wednesday at 1:30. The second optional meeting is on Friday morning at 10:30. The link is the same. It just goes to my personal Zoom room. I'll share that link at the bottom of this video in this announcement, and it's the same one I use for office hours. Bring your questions. If you want to come to these meetings to get some help with this part of the assignment for Unit 5, I highly recommend that you do. I'd love to see as many of you as possible to talk through doing this kind of historical research and historical thinking. But you will have had to have read the documents before showing up. At least a cursory pass through, so you kind of understand what's there, so you'll have some questions for that conversation. And I'll be able to provide a little bit more context as well, since I've done research on that particular period in New Mexico history. So that's what's coming this week. In terms of where we were at, just a few things to keep in mind about primary sources. We got kind of a mixed bag in terms of responses about whether primary sources were more accurate than secondary ones, or people who said it's kind of the other way around. It's kind of the other way around if you think about it. Primary sources are limited in that they were usually created by a certain person who had a certain perspective or certain axe to grind about the events they were writing about. They are not trying generally in a primary source, writing in a journal, writing in a letter. They're not trying to capture the full picture of what was happening, but instead they're trying to present their views of what was happening and why it matters to them or mattered to them. They may be trying to persuade somebody about something, again, if they're in favor of a certain piece of legislation being passed. If we're thinking about the lead up to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which provided women's suffrage, for example, people were writing about that either for or against, depending where they landed on that issue. So they have a certain bias in the kind of writing they're doing and the way that they're describing what the legislation is about, what its outcomes would be, and so on. And so those are all things we have to take into account as we read primary sources. And those are the reasons that even though primary sources are the raw material of history, they are historical evidence, they can be super problematic. And because they were, certain perspectives written by human beings, as humans then, as we try to understand and interpret those kinds of evidence, we have to recognize our own biases, the kinds of assumptions we already bring to the table, and we have to read many different perspectives in order to get a full picture. So that's why a secondary source will likely present a more balanced and even level or an even-handed perspective on past events, because the authors should take into account as many perspectives as possible in order to present their interpretations of what happened. They need to look at a lot of primary sources and many other secondary sources in order to create their narratives. That doesn't mean secondary sources are perfect by any means, as we've been talking about. We have to read those critically, ask questions as we go, but that's one of the key differences. And just to close here, I want to kind of re-emphasize something that Mariah said on Twitter about the contextual nature of sources. When she was thinking about primary sources, she described them as being uninterpreted. So they're the sources that have not yet been interpreted. And the secondary level, or the tertiary when it comes, is the interpretation of what those sources meant, reading them together with other ones. I thought that was a very insightful way to think about it. All right. I hope you're doing well again. Please let me know what questions, concerns you have, how things are going. If you weren't able to complete the first week of Unit 5 assignments or anything else that we've done thus far, you can still submit anything and everything for credit. If you have questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out and let me know, and I'm happy to help.